It's nice to have you here, Mark. I would love to hear a little bit more about you. How would you like to introduce yourself?
I'm a historian. I have a PhD in history and I taught for, I think it was 10 years up in Illinois. And my wife is also a historian. And we met and went to the University of Texas, got our PhDs there.
Okay.
And then she was offered a job at the history department at the University of Houston. And I came down and was working through the history department over there. And a colleague said, Mark, you have archive experience, don't you? And I said, yes. Because when I was in grad school, I worked at the LBJ Presidential Library, what is now called the Briscoe Center, a huge archive over there that's got all
Yeah.
kinds of amazing collections. And he told me that about the Hilton College, they needed an archivist over at the Hilton College. And I had never heard of the school. But with the name Conrad Hilton, I kind of figured, oh, okay, I should be my guest just so I can learn something. I knew who Conrad Hilton was because
Yeah.
being a historian, I read the book all the way through. The first of probably 6 or 7 times I've read it. The then Dean John Bowen hired me, took me over to the archive and it was to make sense of it.
Yeah.
And then just working with the Hilton Foundation, Hilton family members, and then various people at Hilton Corporate. We've been able to get the archive in pretty good shape, and we continue to collect material.
What does
Uh,
that look like? So, what would you be collecting?
Almost any and everything related to the hospitality industry. By far, our focus is Hilton. We also collect other hotel brands, companies, and restaurants too, and travel and tourism too, because we're in a public university. People are able to come here and do research in all
Yeah.
aspects of the industry.
Okay. And so
And
this would be like articles,
books,
like old advertisements, books,
well,
artifacts as well?
artifacts, yeah.
Okay.
Because artifacts are really, they help tell the story and you
Yeah.
can see how things change, like at the menus. I mean, yeah, the prices from way back when are amazing. But if you see the artwork that they install, like we recently acquired, I think it's a 1936 menu from the Lubbock Hilton.
Wow.
And,
Okay.
and while the prices are amazing and that what food they were offering
Hmm.
at point in time, but you also see how Hilton included images of his other Hilton properties at that
Mm-hmm.
point.
Yeah.
Um, and you see those images, and I can see things later on in advertisements how this menu is the earliest I can document it.
Mm.
I see the same thing happening later on.
Setting a trend
Yeah.
that then others follow along. Yeah, that's something that I wanted to talk about with you is this idea of I think there's a lot of stuff within what you've done in the archiving and your observations probably that you've seen trends being set. And I would love to hear some of those examples, some of those stories.
Well, for me, I have just a couple of images, that's all, of the opening of the El Paso Hilton, which opened in 1929. But this was the property that he opened or he announced it's going to be built. And then the Great Depression starts, but still opens the property. And if you look at those pictures, that the lobby is grander, is bigger, and you see other little touches that, oh, this is the earliest I see this in what becomes a standard in a Hilton hotel.
Mhm.
And by the first Hilton that he opened, the first hotel with his name on it that he opens is the Dallas Hilton, 1925.
Mhm.
And why that was cutting edge, no rooms on the west wall, a ceiling fan in every room. And I should say, for people who don't know, Dallas gets extremely hot in the summertime.
Yeah.
And you see these introductions of technology that can make the guest experience a little bit better.
Yeah.
And by the time he builds the El Paso property, you see it even more so. But then the Great Depression hits, and then he almost loses everything. And then he's got to build himself back up. And then World War II hits. So, I mean, there's no money for anything other than the war effort. It's
Mm.
not until the after World War II, and you've got to give a couple of years for the economy to shake out and get back into a normal peacetime type of economy after the war, that
Yeah.
you begin to see the additions of things. And the first hotel he built ground up after World War II was the Beverly Hilton. And that's mid 50s. And by then you see all these really, by the 50s standards, luxurious items coming into this hotel. They would become sort of a company standard for the most part.
Yeah. Yeah.
So he had this ability to kind of see things, but he would also freely admits that certain things he thought would work well, and they just don't work out. So and that's the beauty of being my guest. As a historian who has read more memoirs, usually political memoirs, than I want to count,
Yeah.
it was refreshing to read it because he talked about his mistakes, owned up to them, but
Yeah.
he persevered and went on.
I pulled this up before I came in the room today. I found it in my shelf. It's been a long time, but you can see I've got an old copy
Yeah.
as well. Yeah, when I started at Hilton, I didn't really know about Conrad Hilton, but then just like hearing these stories about, not a perfect person, like somebody that did really try to push the limits in so many ways. What really stuck with me was this concept of dreaming big dreams, right?
Yeah.
And to accomplish great things, you've got to dream big dreams. And what you're saying, right, of this, if you're dreaming big dreams, you will face setbacks like the depression. You go through wars, you almost lose it all. But if you really have this thing that is inspiring you to move forward, that dream is what can keep that alive.
And it's that vision that he had that other people saw. He was an honorable guy.
Yeah.
So when he almost loses the El Paso Hilton at the Depression, if you remember, he merged Hilton with the Moody interests and it was a disaster. And they basically could have had the El Paso Hilton, but there was more debt associated with it than they wanted to deal with. And I forget it. Well, the guy who actually owned the building had worked with Conrad in the past, honorable, and said, if you can just get $30,000, I'll let you have the contract back. And,
Wow.
and,
Yeah.
and then Conrad goes to several people. He knows them. They know him. They know he's an honorable guy. They lend him the money. But he also says something. He says to this one guy, Bob Price, who owned the local dairy creamery business in El Paso. If you lend me this money, I promise you I'll always buy my dairy products from you as long as I have this hotel here in El Paso.
Mm.
And he lived up to that. The guy owned a laundry where the sheets and towels went for laundry thing there.
Yeah.
But that he was able to get the money for these people to begin with was because he had shown the honorable side of him. Because everyone realized in the Depression that, everyone suffered. And it wasn't through necessarily Conrad's fault that he was in this shape, the whole economy.
Right. Yeah.
But they knew that this was a guy who was honorable and a go-getter.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, and, to carry this even farther, he didn't forget these people because when he went to buy the Stevens Hotel in Chicago in 1945, now the Chicago Hilton, he went back to them and said, I'm about to buy a bunch of shares of stock in this hotel and we're going to make it part of the Hilton chain. Do you want to join me in this endeavor and buying and he invited them, I'm sure at a lower rate. They bought shares and helped.
Yeah. That's great. So from your studies of this and looking at the archives, I don't know exactly where does Conrad Hilton fall in the timeline and what was happening elsewhere. So where did Marriott come into the picture or any other brands that we know today?
I'll say the first most people haven't heard of is the Statler brand. And I think it's fair to say they were the hotel chain company for the first half of the 20th century.
Okay.
And Ellsworth Statler, who had never went to college, one of these stories, he just had a genius about hotel operation. The thing that I find most fascinating of him is I'll say 90% of the hotel rooms that you check in today, you open the door and to your left or your right is going to be the bathroom. And then you have the room. He- Basically, he came up with that concept of design and in the early 20th century, and he saw the bathroom as being a buffer from the noise in the hallway. Then if you put that bathroom backed up to the bathroom in the next room, you're saving on piping costs.
Wow.
And even Conrad talks about what a genius he was. And then after World War II, more Americans are traveling by automobile. You have the rise of what they would call the motor inn or the motor
Hmm.
lodge. The reason the word motel was somehow not as respectable as hotel. You have the development of Holiday Inn, Kimmons Wilson. And I shouldn't forget Howard Johnson, who started in restaurants. And then in 1954, built the first Howard Johnson in Savannah, Georgia. So you have the
Hmm.
development of these. Marriott comes in, well, let me back up. Marriott owned well, in Texas, we called them Kip's Big Boy, but in other parts of the country, they're called Shoney's. But they bought that kind of franchise for the Washington, D.C. area. And my understanding is that in the 50s, Bill Marriott went to his dad and said, we should get into the hotel business. They opened up the first Marriott, I want to say in 57, 58 in suburban Washington, D.C. And the rest is history and continue to grow. But then you've got Cecil Day came up with Days Inn. He saw a niche for what Days Inn would cater to a certain segmentation of the industry. Back then, they didn't have the word segmentation, even though that's
Yeah.
what they were doing. And Travel Lodge, another one that was catered to the driving public. Uh, Getting off subject here for a minute, but one of the fascinating things I like to do is when I know I'm going to be traveling, and I usually drive because I like to take pictures of old hotels and motels to add to the image collection. Is get once I'm getting to a town, get off the interstate and get on the old U.S. highway that goes through the town. You can
Mm.
see all the old motels that developed. I mean, they most likely have changed name and have changed ownership several times since they were originally built. But there are certain towns I'll go in and you can just see all the national brands from the 50s and the 60s
Yeah.
on this highway going into town.
Mm.
It's a time capsule of the industry at that point in time.
Yeah. So that's interesting to hear what you're saying about the like Howard Johnson and the Marriott's being in the space of franchises of restaurants, right?
Yeah.
And then moving into hospitality, did they then bring in the idea of franchising the hotel brand? I would assume for a while, self owned, your name is on it, you're putting the money down and getting the financing. At some point, you say, oh, okay, now I've got a model that I can get other people to put their money down and own the individual hotels, and we be the brand behind that.
Right.
Do you have any insight into that of like when that happened or kind of what brought that about?
I give credit to Howard Johnson, and it was just at this point restaurants for him. And they were all along the East Coast, and they put some on the then new Pennsylvania Turnpike in the 30s. But he was very strict on you must follow these guidelines. He wanted that seamless experience of going to a different Howard Johnson's restaurant, and you'll have that same good quality experience. Bring that after World War II into the hotels. He very much wanted that also for what they called motor lodges. The problem is, I think, when there were certain, I'll say, motel companies out there who were basically doing it for the quick profit.
Right.
Hey, here's what our target audience is. And they get a bunch of franchisers out there to join up with them without strong franchise things. It's gonna,
Yeah, it
yeah,
leads to degradation
yeah,
of the brand.
yeah.
Sure.
And once you get a bad reputation, it's really hard to come back from that.
Yeah.
And it was one of the issues, but I give Howard Johnson the credit for that.
Yeah.
He really did have a good quality control
It's funny, if I'm talking to somebody that doesn't work in the hotel industry, they're oftentimes surprised that someone else owns the Hampton Inn that they stayed in. And to hear someone owns that property and then someone else manages it, right? And the brand is the one that is managing the quality control and helping drive a lot of business into this local hotel. But it's a kind of a foreign concept to some folks to think, oh, this isn't actually one company doing everything. And I've found that really interesting. I would love to know, do you have any insight into when I would assume you go from large owners to then franchises with multiple owners, that management companies probably didn't come in until some later point in time, right? Somebody realizing, I want to take the risk and put the money down, but I don't want to operate this property in the day to day. And then somebody decided, let's aggregate that and create these management companies. Do you have any insight there?
A little bit, but let me back up and say
Okay.
I plead guilty until I took this job.
Yeah.
I thought Hilton owned every Hilton, that type of thing. And it took me a while to kind of wrap my head around it. What I can speak mostly to is Hilton, and I may
Yeah.
get something wrong in here, so forgive me.
Sure.
But I think as the tax laws have evolved through the years, it became more profitable and beneficial for the hotel companies to not own the property, but as with Hilton that has a good reputation, a good brand, they don't really need to own those properties. And when I remember when I interviewed Baron Hilton, and he was a very nice man, very generous with his time. I found him very fascinating. I'm not a math person at all. I'm a historian. I asked him a couple questions about some real estate transactions that just
Mm-hmm.
seemed to make sense to me.
Yeah.
And within 5 minutes, he explained it very clearly. And basically, to his thinking, Wall Street did not reward Hilton stock value for the property that it owned, even though it was valuable
Mm-hmm.
property in downtown New
Right.
York and stuff. Not going to reward us for that. Then why are we holding on to it? Yeah.
Right.
So he began to sell the properties. Now, once again, like his father, he's very shrewd on this. When he sold the Beverly Hilton, a marquee property for Hilton, he made sure that the buyer, if they ever decide to sell it, lets Hilton Hotels have first refusal on.
Yeah.
And if I remember correctly, he bought and sold the Beverly Hilton a couple of times. And usually he was selling the Beverly Hilton at the high market and buying it at the low market.
I
I
think
found
that makes a lot of sense. It complicates the business model, I would assume, when it comes to earnings reports and all of
Mhm.
that. And like you're saying, your intrinsic value might not meet what your market cap ends up being because of all of these assets that you
Mhm.
have. And that's also very hard to keep track of. And that fluctuates based on what else is going on. So, to your point, if you're then saying, here's our business model is that we grow hotels, we help them perform well, and here's how we generate our revenue, owning the real estate itself doesn't have to be part of that equation.
Exactly.
Mm.
And that if the tax laws change, if they do things differently, the model will have to change with it. But it's gotten to the point where you've got all the real estate investment trusts out there,
Right.
and they want to own the hotels and properties. I remember when Chris Nassetta sold the Waldorf Astoria, and a lot of people were like, "Oh my gosh!" And to me, it was like it was a brilliant stroke. He sold it at a high market, and just like Bear and just like Conrad, Chris made sure if you decide to sell it, we get first crack at buying it back.
Yeah.
That's as close to owning the property as you can get without owning it.
Yeah. Yeah. So you mentioned REITs. I know the number I've heard is like over 75% of hotels are owned by individual families still. But there are a lot of larger institutional investors that own a lot of properties. And then do you have any insight into the management company thing? Because a REIT is not going to want to manage a hotel.
Yeah,
Those maybe required each other.
the management companies are kind of a nebulous thing. They're all a little bit different,
Yeah.
and some they come and go. And I have to tell a story on this one. Did you remember hearing of Felcor that got sold off, or they sold to another company? I forget who. And one of the executives retired, and he had been to the archive before. He had taken a tour of it, and he was retiring, and he contacted me, a very nice gentleman, and said, "Mark, I've got a bunch of hotel stuff. A lot of it's Hilton, but not everything. Do you want it for the archive?" Yes.
Yeah.
I ended up adding 45 bankers boxes full of hotel material
Wow.
across several brands. I mean, it was a gold mine, but that particular estate investment trust, what have you, had sold to another one. And it's kind of a way we acquired material.
When I think about hospitality, I think about being taken care of. That's what hospitality means to me. And I'm curious for you, what's the first memory that comes to mind personally for you experiencing hospitality?
My very first, well, I'll go back to when I was a little boy. I grew up in Dallas, and we would always uh, travel by station wagon, go back and visit relatives on the East Coast. We would drive until we got to a town with a hotel and stop there. And I always remember going in with my parents to check in. Yeah, it was always a fun and exciting thing for me as a kid. Looking back, my parents were probably exhausted from the drive
Yeah.
and having a bunch of kids in the car. But it was always a friendly face and a welcoming people. And seems like we stayed at a Ramada Inn or a Howard Johnson Holiday Inn and, with a swimming pool. And then
Mhm.
fast forward to when I take this job here at the college, and it's drilled into the kids with these students, and it's just amazing. They go above and beyond to make sure that the guests have a nice time and are happy and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And in this day and age we live in, you really can't have enough hospitality.
Yeah, I agree. I ended in hospitality, like in revenue management, but as I learned about what's the underlying principle motivation for hotels, it got me like I haven't been able to leave because I just love this idea of taking care of people. I'm curious if we went back on this timeline of hotels, I would assume the first examples I can think of are like in scriptural texts, right?
Yeah.
Thousands of years old, stories about there being an inn and the inn being there to take care of weary travelers, right? You're traveling not probably not for fun. Like you're leaving something that's hard. You're
Right.
trying to get somewhere else and you're exhausted and that having an inn was something of how can I take care of these people and their horses and their family, give them a place that's safe while they're then going back on the road. I don't know of anything further than that in history that would be an example, but I'd be curious if you have thoughts around that.
I know a British or Scottish hospitality professor who's written on that thing, and I don't know if it's before the birth of Christ or not,
Sure.
but it addresses exactly what you were just mentioning, and you see it carried forward the centuries and
Right.
stuff. It,
Right.
what I will also add is that hospitality is often, I'll say, the forgotten industry because we all know about, I'm in Houston, the oil industry, banking, the Hollywood industry, and stuff like this. But people forget about hospitality. The the hotel and restaurant industry, very large, but for some reason they think of banks and the other insurance companies first. They don't think about the hotel companies or the restaurant companies.
Right.
I mean, I don't know why that is really. I find it fascinating. As a historian, I can go in the main library here at the university and see all kinds of corporate histories about any other industry, but on the hotel industry, it's about yay big.
Interesting. Even just looking at the root word of hospitality and hospital, it is
Yeah,
like caring, taking care of And so one is taking care of someone that needs medical attention, possibly. But I love the idea of in this world that we live in, everyone is a weary traveler. They're inundated by so much work and so many distractions and so many things going on. To have someone look them in the eye and smile and take care of them and let
Yeah.
them know that they're safe and that they'll be taken care of and that we're glad they're here. All of those things can mean so much to someone. And that's something I think that resonates with me. And then I think about what you're saying about what Conrad Hilton did, right? He's thinking people are staying at inns and smaller places, but the world is changing. And there are ways for me to maybe better meet those needs than what exist right now. And pushing the innovation of that is based on like how the world is changing, right? Like you're saying, like interstates are being built, behavior is changing, air conditioners come around, the TV becomes a thing. All of these things continue to push and evolve what is being built and how we take care of people. And I think about that now. There's always still new opportunity for innovation of meeting today's weary traveler, right?
Because who knows what's gonna be invented that
Mhm.
will have a nice role in hospitality. I mean, two
Yeah.
things from a historical perspective. When I
Yeah.
was interviewing Baron Hilton about television
Mm.
being into the hotel rooms,
Yeah.
when you think of Hilton, Conrad in the early 50s was the head of the company, and the leadership team was of a certain age. They were either born in the 19th century or the early 20th century. And Barron, who's a generation younger, is saying we really need to be installing television in our guest rooms. And he had pushback on it, but he saw the future forward a couple years, and we've got most copies of the old Hilton advertisements. And there's in the mid 50s, they had an advertisement that said Hilton leads the way and then fill in whatever the phrase was.
Yeah.
And this was in air conditioning.
Yeah.
And I know this because I interviewed a retired Hilton executive who had to make this decision. Back in the day, back in the early 50s, the downtown New York and Chicago properties for Hilton were not air conditioned. And the decision was like, should Hilton spend money to air condition these big, massive hotels that had been built without air conditioning, and just thinking of the cost of installing an air conditioning system in a hotel that wasn't designed for it.
Yeah.
And yeah, it was the Chicago hotels, the New York hotels, and I think the DC hotels were all going to be air conditioned. And it was going to be like $5 million back in the 50s. And the board was like really concerned, would we, make our money on this? Will we lose? We're just wasting $5 million. And the gentleman I interviewed told me he worked for either the Palmer House or the Chicago Hilton. I forget which one he worked at. And what he had done, and like everyone did, is he worked from roughly October to May at the Chicago Hilton or Palmer House. Then left Chicago and worked resorts somewhere for the summer months and
Right.
then came back. The air conditioned, Hilton said, you've got to either commit to us year round or go somewhere else. And this was a change for him. I mean, he had been doing this for, several years. But he committed to Hilton. Smart move on his part. He rose in the company and said, we can't imagine nowadays hotels being built without air conditioning. But
Right.
what is it made the convention business in Chicago and New York thrive in the summer months now that they had
Mm.
air conditioning?
Mm.
And it created the 12-month convention business in these cities that had not
Yeah.
existed previously. And the board of Hilton did not see this aspect coming,
Right.
but this was one of the neat side benefits of it.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's just to me an interesting, you can look at the dollars and the numbers, is this the right thing to do? But there's always the potential of some side effect that you don't
Right.
know.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think about how quickly the world's changing. And this is one of those businesses that, yes, there are things happening behind the computer, But there's so much that's happening face to face that, yes, technology is going to continue to evolve and adapt. But I think it's going to become more and more important that what's happening on the face to face interaction is authentic and a quality level of service. That I'm curious how, with the current trends, how things will evolve. Like, what's next? Do you have any guesses?
Oh, uh, don't ask a historian to guess
Yeah,
the future.
right,
Yeah.
right.
I mean, because
Yeah,
I can't think of the particular classes, but I'll hear that they're now teaching a class on something, and I'm like, huh? And then they explain it to me. It's like, oh, I had no idea that was an issue or I
yeah,
knew
sure.
where they're going. In this day and age we live in, there's just a constant bombardment of
Mm,
new ideas and stuff like that. Some of them good, some of them bad.
sure.
But and I'm just fascinated. I'm as a person who's, as you well know, not the most savvy IT person, the bombardment of new technological things that how do the companies stay current, up to date? Is this just a passing fad, or is this something that's going to be an industry must have? You know,
Right.
and how do you decide? You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
I'm glad I don't have to do it.
Yeah. 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 Well, is there anything else that you wanted to talk about today that we didn't talk about?
No, this is kind of a nice, refreshing about the industry. I'm not a hotelier. I wasn't trained in it, but I find it fascinating. And in charge of this archive, I literally and truthfully do say I learn something new or discover something new every day. It's
Yeah.
no no 2 days are the same because there's always something different going on.
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that you've dedicated your time and your craft to that because I think it's so important for all of us. So I'm looking forward to coming and visiting the archive and spending some time with you sometime soon.
come on down.
Okay.
We're open unless there's a hurricane.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Mark.
Okay.
Yeah, I
Thank
look
you.
forward to talking to you again soon.
Okay.
All right.
Bye bye.
Bye.